I want to thank you for the award. It's especially an honor to be sharing the award with Isaac Asimov, one of my heroes. Now, I never read any of Isaac's science fiction stories, for which he is well known, but I have read almost all his educational science books. In fact, I would say most of my knowledge of sciences outside of psychology comes from having read Isaac Asimov. My favorite Isaac Asimov book, which I still have on my bookshelf and I consult quite frequently, is his biographical history, I guess it is, of I think the title is something like that. It's a biographical encyclopedia of science. And he does this book in an interesting way. He includes all the scientists of any note at all from the very beginning of the history of science, in fact, even before the history of science, to the present day, at least the present day when he wrote his second edition of this, which was 1972. He has over 1,000 scientists, and he begins his first one with Imhotep, almost 3,000 years ago, actually almost 5,000 years ago, and he then ends, his very last entry, interesting enough, is Carl Sagan. Now, as I said, he wrote this in 1972. It's a fascinating way of telling the history of science, and I keep, as I said, I keep looking up things in it. Now, Isaac Asimov, as most people may know or not know, was one of the most prolific authors of all time. In his relatively short life, he wrote almost 500 books in science fiction, science, religion, a variety of other areas. He also wrote many, many, many articles, essays, and what have you. So I was my favorite story about Isaac is when, after he died, Arthur Clarke, I heard him give a sort of a eulogy, and he said that he once asked Isaac, he said, "Look, Isaac, if you knew you had only a few months to live, how would you react?" And Isaac immediately shot back and said, "I would type faster." Now, Houdini, I'm going to go on to the other recipients of this award. Houdini I never met personally, because he died 2 years before I was born. But I did, I think, as soon as I could read, the very first book I read were about Houdini. I was a magician, began doing my first professional show at age 7, and Houdini was my hero, and it was because of Houdini that I, as far as I can remember, in my lifetime, decided I have to be a skeptic. If I'm going to be a magician, I also have to be a skeptic and expose mediums and what have you. Carl Sagan, who was the last entry in the book by Asimov, Carl Sagan, I was at several conventions at which he was at also, but I never got to meet him. He was always surrounded by a cadre of admirers and handlers, I would say, and you couldn't get near him. Joe Nickell, of course, I know very well, and Joe is undoubtedly the world's most prolific investigator of all things paranormal. I don't think there is a single opportunity that he has missed to investigate a claim, no matter how trivial or how important. The three people on this list that are most familiar to me are my good friends Martin Gardner and James Randi. Both Randi and I are sort of disciples of Martin. I met Martin in 1950 at a magic function in New York, and we were friends ever since until his passing away. We corresponded a lot. We worked together on investigations of various sorts, and we always were communicating either by phone or by old-fashioned snail mail. Martin didn't have email until the very, very end. Also, Martin is sort of the most inspiration, at least for Randi and myself, I suspect for many others, as sort of the instigator of the skeptical movement with his classic book, first in 1952 and then a revised version in 1957, Fads and Fallacies in the Names of Science. This is the prototype, the model that I, and I know Randi, have used in our own approach to evaluating skeptical claims. Now, Randi, in 1973, was traveling with the Alice Cooper show. He played the part of a mad doctor that at the end of the show beheaded Alice Cooper, and then there was a resurrection scene where they restored Alice's head and brought Alice back to life. But anyway, when this tour, the Alice Cooper tour, came to Portland, Oregon, in 1973, I received a phone call from Randi. I was living in Eugene, and I still live in Eugene, which is about a 2-hour drive to Portland. And Randi said, "Ray, you have to come up to Portland and meet with Alice Cooper, because Alice would like your advice and help in trying to understand why certain audiences like him and certain audiences avoid him." Well, I drove up to Portland, and I spent a very fascinating... at the time I drove up to Portland, I thought Alice Cooper was a she, but it turned out, of course, Alice Cooper was a he, and quite an interesting character. I spent the day with him and his crew, and then I sat on the stage, and was able to observe the show and discuss it with Alice. But one of the main reasons why Randi actually wanted me to come to Portland was because we had both just recently had encounters with Uri Geller. And Randi wanted to discuss the possibility of doing something about Uri Geller and his ilk taking in scientists. And he thought we ought to form a group of some sort. And his name for the group that he suggested was SIR, S-I-R. And this was in response, a reaction to the initials SRI, which was Stanford Research Institute, where Geller had been studied. Well, we did form a group, and the group consisted of Martin Gardner, Randi, and myself. We met at Martin Gardner's house in 1973. Martin lived at that time in Hastings-on-the-Hudson, on wonderfully on the street called Euclid Avenue, which fit in well with Martin's, of course, avocation. We spent the day at Martin's house, even having all our meals there, and we worked on the plans for a skeptic organization, stuff like that. And in 1976, SIR, that's Randi, Martin Gardner, and myself, we merged with Paul Kurtz and some of his friends, and we started what was called PsyCop, and that is the beginning of the skeptical movement, and the rest is history. Thank you again for the award. I feel very, very honored.